welcome back to Think Outside the Board. It's time for another monthly update. And this month we're going to do things a little bit differently moving forward. I'm going to be publishing 2 monthly updates a month instead of just one. There are 2 reasons for this. One, I think it'll be better if the videos are shorter and focus on fewer games. That way it won't be such a long, unwieldy video. And the other reason is I'm trying to focus these videos mainly on currently running Kickstarters. And I think doing 1 video a month, it just doesn't allow me to identify and talk about what's current. There's just too great a chance that by the time I get the video edited and posted, things are going to already have finished their campaign. Or conversely, I might be talking about games that are so far out that it's hard for me to have much to say about them. So 2 videos a month. These videos are going to be premiering on the first and third Mondays each month. And that means that this video we have 10 games we're going to be talking about on Kickstarter. It's actually 6 campaigns, but one of those campaigns features 2 games and another campaign features 4 games. And then I'll also be spending a little time at the end of the video talking about a few other games. Games that I've played since the last video, which for this video it's 2 games. Really 1, because one of them is a game I've talked about in the past. So there's really 1 new game. And then I'll be talking about the 3 new games that I've acquired since the last video. And finally I'll be talking about any games that I've backed since the last video, personally. Games I personally backed. And in this video, it happens to be 2 games. So we'll be talking about 10 games, then 1 to 2 games, then 3 games, and 2 games. So let's get started. The first Kickstarter on our list of games to watch is the Stefan Feld collection. Now that Kickstarter is going to end on September 8th. This is kind of a whole new project on the part of Queen Games. They're publishing this whole Stefan Feld collection, which is only going to be available through their Kickstarters or eventually directly through their website. So none of these games are planned to come to retail. Queen Games does not put out the prettiest, most lavish games on the planet. Okay, they do a lot of very solid Euros by some great designers, but they tend to, their production standards tend to be 10 to 20 years old. So you might get some very, very solid games, but usually they have, kind of wooden components, standard boards, nothing very special. So they're upping the stakes a little bit with this new Stefan Feld collection. They're going to be putting out Kickstarters for this collection 2 games at a time. And I think they're shooting to do 8 games total. The first one obviously is up right now, and it features 2 redesigns of big classic Feld games. One is Bruges, the other one is Macau. Now Bruges has long been on my list of games to play. It is just, from what I know, it's considered to be one of Feld's best games. But Bruges is out of print, and it's not a particularly big, elaborate, big box game or anything. It's essentially a card game. A new copy of Bruges is going to be $160 about on Amazon, which is not a small price tag. And for a game that's really mostly a card game, that's very overpriced. So if you're wanting to acquire Bruges or you've ever wanted to play Bruges, this perhaps may be your chance to get the game, even though it's now called Hamburg, and it's supposed to be the new definitive version. So much so, in fact, that Richard Ham, aka Rado runs through, has said that he's done with Bruges and it's all Hamburg from now on. So that's at least one very, very positive opinion for the new redesign of the game. Now, it's going to have some elements in it that were already out there and that existed. I know there's some expansions to Bruges, and those will be included in the new designs. You're going to get pretty much, I think, everything that existed with Bruges in the past. Plus, there's redesigns to the game, there's tweaking of rules, there's improvements. I'm sure there's probably some new little mini expansions and things as well. And then Macau, which is being redone and redesigned as Amsterdam, looks even different. The board for it doesn't even really resemble the old Macau board. It has some of the same kind of mechanics on it, but it's a very different sort of board. Which, I guess that makes sense if you're modeling it after a different city. Which it seems like most of the games in this collection are going to be new city-named redesigns of old games. So we already know that the third and fourth games in the series are going to be, well, one's going to be a redesign of Rialto, and the other one's going to be a completely new game. And there is the option in this Kickstarter, if you're really forward-thinking and forward-spending, that you can pledge for those 2 games in a future campaign, as well as Hamburg and Amsterdam in this campaign. Now, I don't know if I necessarily recommend doing that, because the pledge level that includes those games seems to only give you maybe a $5 or $10 discount from what that pledge will probably end up being if you do it separately. And that includes shipping, so I don't think you're getting a huge savings there. And we don't really know that much about those games yet. We haven't really seen what the design of Rialto is going to look like, and we don't know what that fourth game is going to be. So just kind of wildly pledging for those games right now, that's not something I'd probably encourage, but the option is there if you want to do that. And then in the next year, 2, 3, we don't know how long it'll take, they're going to be running a few more Kickstarter campaigns, and I think they're going to do a total of 8 games at least in the Stefan Feld collection. There's some ability to get like numbered versions of the game, and if you pledge, really high pledge level, you can get a small numbering in the hundreds, and I think you can even get the future games to match those numbers. But that seems a lot of work for something that's very inconsequential, so it's not something that I personally am worried about. For me, I'm probably going to pledge the 2 games now and just get the numbering for them, whatever it is. And then later in a future campaign, if I back more games, I'll probably end up with a different numbering for those, but that's fine for me. I don't see a reason to need the numbering to all be the same on all the games, or to spend enough to do that. It's not very important. But I am very much looking to owning a copy of Bruges and finally being able to play it, and I do feel confident that it's going to be a very, very good version of the game. Now, Queen Games is doing classic versions of these games, meaning probably the same kind of components that we're used to from Queen Games, which is not particularly fantastic, but you can play the game and it'll be fine. And then they're doing deluxe versions, and the deluxe versions come with improved components, things like silkscreen meeples, and they look pretty good. I think even from Queen Games, a deluxe version may not be on the level of some other games' deluxe versions. But still, it's going to look a lot nicer and prettier than the regular Queen Games versions. However, they're not cheap. I think if you get both of those deluxe versions of the games, you're looking at over $200 for the two games. And $200 for 2 Queen games, considering their quality level, even at their version of a deluxe version of the game, it's definitely a number that you need to think on, because I don't think it's a must-back necessarily. But if you like Stefan Feld and you want to get some of his best games, perhaps the best versions that we're going to be seeing for quite some time, and really the only version of Bruges, even though I'm saying that these games are kind of expensive, it's $100 a pop, more or less. If we go back to the fact that getting a new version of the previous version of Bruges is going to cost you $160 by itself, you're still getting a good deal if you back both Amsterdam and Hamburg. So I've probably talked about that enough for right now, but that is Amsterdam and Hamburg coming to you through the Stefan Feld collection. The next game on our list is Dining with Dracula, which has an end date of September 10th. It's a worker placement game. There's resource management. It's from Too Fat to Fly Games, who previously did Moonshiners of the Apocalypse and The Trouble with Templetown. And they're a publisher that's definitely caught my eye. I haven't backed any of their games yet. It seemed to me that they weren't quite up to the level that I wanted in a game that I owned or that I backed. But I really like the energy behind this company, and I really like what I've seen from them, and I'm like waiting for that moment to kind of jump on and dive into their games. And I think very soon they're going to just be producing a bunch of hits, because they're ramping up in that direction, and everything they've done to date has been impressive. Now, Dining with Dracula has some pretty cool resources because it's a Dracula-themed game, and the players in the game are descendants of Dracula competing for his inheritance, and they're trying to get local townspeople to Dracula's feast to be feasted upon. So some of the resources are resources that will appeal to the villagers you're trying to recruit, like beer and donuts. I guess they're in the Homer Simpson vein. And then there's also components like hearts and blood and holy water and stuff like that. So the components are really neat. If you're looking for a worker placement game that's heavily thematic and has a lot of clever design to it with a very smart sense of humor to it, then you should definitely check out Dining with Dracula. Also completing its Kickstarter on September 10th is a game called Uprising, Curse of the Emperor. Now, this is a very interesting looking game. It's a 4X game. It's also a co-op, and there are quests available in the game. So Uprising is very point salad-y in its grab bag of mechanics, because you've got this kind of like dudes on a map thing happening. You've got all of the 4X stuff, and it's a co-op. And not only that, the dudes on the map are a little bit different than what we've seen before with dudes. These particular dudes are not miniatures, they're not meeples, they're standees. But rather than being normal standees, they have these kind of acrylic colored backings to them. So when you have these very bright, colorful warriors out on the board, and they look really neat, they're kind of like this great comic book art in their character design. But then they're mounted on these kind of very bright acrylic standees. Their colors like hot pink, neon yellow, kind of a bright, shiny, brickish red. So definitely this game is going to pop. And I think it's something like Dinosaur Island, where the color scheme could be for some people off-putting, or for other people an incentive, just because it's so colorful and attention-grabbing. And then apart from that, there's the other part of the game, which is the gameplay, the 4X, the co-op side. And I've also heard great things about the quests in the game, and that while you're kind of doing these Euro-y mechanics, the quests are very, they just add a lot of flavor to the gameplay and are very interesting. Then on the 14th, Dr. Finn's Games finishes its campaign. Now, Steve Finn has been designing and publishing games for a while now. He designed stuff like Sunset Over Water, Biblios, Herbaceous Sprouts, and he self-publishes a lot of his stuff. And he tends to make very well-designed, lighter games. So they're games that are designed to appeal to a broad range of gamers, that can be easily taught to new gamers, so there won't be too much of a barrier of entry, but that also have enough choices so the gamers who like games of a deeper complexity will still be interested and have something of value. And Steve Finn's doing something a little bit different with this one. In the past, he's tended to kickstart one game at a time, but with this Kickstarter, he's trying to kickstart all of his games for 2020, I guess, or 2021, the games that'll be published in 2021. And there are 4 games here. There's a game called Mining Colony, which is sort of a resource gathering game, and it's being done on another planet. And there's polyominoes that you're placing in a player board. So you're trying to drill for resources on another planet, and you're gathering them in this kind of polyomino like tile player board with tiles. He's got another game called Nanga Parbat, which is themed around Sherpas, and he himself describes it as almost an abstract game, but it's very colorful. It's got a lot of meeples. It's got animal meeples and some kind of cool like tents and things like that. And you're kind of creating an array of both livestock that you're gathering for food and also camps that you're building. The third game that's a part of this Kickstarter is called Biblios Quill and Parchment. You may have heard of Biblios. That's perhaps his most famous game. It was published by a bigger publisher. And this is a roll and write version of Biblios. So it's a little smaller, a little scaled back, themed similarly, but a smaller, lighter game and a roll and write. The last game in this series is called the Butterfly Collection, and that is themed around some sort of butterfly preserve or kind of like community garden that's being destroyed, I think, by developers. And so the butterflies there need to be relocated to other butterfly habitats. It's a very colorful set collection game. Most of Steve Finn's games are variations on set collection. So all four of these games are available through this Kickstarter, and I don't know if you might feel like you need to back all four of them, but you can kind of pick and choose and back for the ones that you want. Then, finishing its Kickstarter on September 18th is Mercado de Lisboa. And this is a game by Vital Lacerda. However, it is not anywhere near as complex as most of his games, which you may know, such as On Mars, Lisboa, Venus, The Gallerist. He makes some of my favorite games in the world, but they're very heavy games. They don't appeal to all types of gamers. If you've ever played Lisboa, you know that one of the mechanics in Lisboa that occupies maybe a third of the board is this kind of grid where players are rebuilding the city of Lisboa after it suffered water damage, fire damage, and I think some kind of earthquake, so rubble damage. And the mechanics that they used for that section of Lisboa have been taken and are being used for this new game called Mercado de Lisboa, which is being billed as kind of a thinky filler. So it's probably a medium light game. I don't think it's too light because it's still Lacerda, but it's about as light as he goes. And I think it'll be a great game for me to play with my fiancée Kristen, because I'll be able to introduce her to some of the mechanics in Lisboa in this smaller game, and then eventually at some point in time when I introduce her to Lisboa, she'll already have this kind of window into it, this doorway into it, because she will already be familiar with a chunk of the game. And Lacerda for me is, if he makes a game, I want to play it. I pretty much want to own it. I think he's amazing. Now he's got a co-designer on this game. His name is Julian Pumbo. It seems like he's very much kind of a Lacerda acolyte, I guess, or from the Lacerda camp. So Julian Pumbo helped create the solo modes for CO2 Second Chance and Lisboa. And then he also worked as a playtester and developer on those two games, as well as on Mars and Escape Plan. So he definitely seems like someone that's been around Lacerda quite a bit, knows the way that Lacerda works, has been co-designing with him a little bit in different ways, and now he is a full co-designer on this game. And he even has another game coming out later in 2021 that Ian O'Toole is doing the artwork for, and Ian O'Toole does the artwork for most Lacerda games. So again, it seems like Julian Pumbo is kind of helping. His launch pad is coming from the Lacerda camp here. And I'm really excited about Mercado de Lisboa. Another thing about this game and several of the others that I'm talking about is that they are smaller Kickstarters, so you're not necessarily going to be spending an arm and a leg to back some of these games, which is a good thing, because sometimes on Kickstarter the games are huge, right, with multi-$100 price tags. So yay, this is another Kickstarter that won't break the bank, that should be a very good lighter game with good choices to be made. Now, the final game in this section that we're going to be talking about today is Rurik Stone and Blade. Rurik Stone and Blade is designed by Stan Kordonsky, and I was aware of Rurik the first time around. The base game was called Rurik Dawn of Kiev. At the time that it was on Kickstarter, I think I had several other pledges happening at the time, and Rurik just didn't quite make my list. But Jeremy Howard, who is now at Man vs. Meeple and used to do a lot of work his own through Jambalaya Plays Games, has been really talking Rurik up. And because it was something that I'd already had just kind of been a narrow miss for me before, I'm on board with it this time, and I'm really excited about it. Essentially, Rurik is a dudes on a map game, and there's sort of a kind of an action selection, almost auction mechanism that happens at the beginning of rounds, where players place meeples, and the meeples have different values on them, and they're placing them kind of in these columns to be able to do different things like attack or move or tax for money. And when one player places a meeple in a column that already has the meeples get ordered by the number on the meeple. Okay, so the larger numbers will go first. So if I were to place a 2 meeple in the attack column, and then you were to come in later and put a 3 meeple in the attack column, it would go over my meeple, and you would get the more powerful action. And then later in the game, when players are actually taking their actions, they're taken in sort of the reverse order. They're taken from the lowest number to the highest number. So it's a kind of a Euro-y puzzle. It simulates a dudes on a map game in that there is attacking, and you're moving around this board, and it's being done essentially for area control. But it's a very simple version of this. There's not elaborate combat. Usually what's happening when someone attacks is that the pieces are either coming off the board and or they're being replaced with pieces from the other player. But there's not usually like heavy combat with a lot of rules. It's just putting pieces on or taking them off, moving them around, getting area control. It's sort of a Euro-y puzzle. The new expansion, called Rurik Stone and Blade, adds in 3 new modules, and you can use those in any combination, and they just give you more variability to the puzzle that is Rurik. Now, Stan Kordonsky has worked on a few games before this. The Rurik base game, he's also worked on Dice Hospital, but I think we're going to start to see a lot from him moving forward, because Rurik is getting a lot more hype, and he has another game coming out soon called Endless Winter, which looks like it's going to be another hugely successful game. So I'm excited to see what he does next, and I'm excited to play both Rurik and Endless Winter when that eventually releases. So there are your 6 Kickstarter campaigns that we're covering in this video, 10 games, and now that we've finished those, I'm going to move on and talk about the 2 games that I've played since the last video. Now, the first one of those is Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion, and I don't plan on talking about it too much because I've already talked about it in past videos, but I will say that my fiance Kristen and I are continuing our campaign. I think we're on the 7th scenario. We have unlocked one additional scenario that we have yet to do that's character specific for one of our characters. And we've gotten to a point in the game where we've died a couple times on a specific scenario. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to give anything away. The first time that we got stuck, that we failed that scenario, was really sort of a misinterpretation of the rules. the way the map is laid out, I didn't realize that there were walls in certain places. So I thought certain rooms were connected when they weren't. And it just messed everything up. And then later we went back and we tried to play it correctly. And there was just a problem with actions. I did several things that didn't really pan out. And we basically, we lost the scenario. Although, in Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion, there are sometimes treasure chests in scenarios, and you can only pick them up once. So if you play through a scenario and you grab a chest and then you have to replay the scenario in the future, you don't get to take that chest again. You're going to keep it from the first scenario, and then it's just not going to be there. So I think that when we finally get around to playing this scenario now for a third time, I think we'll be okay, because we won't be trying to get that chest. We'll just be trying to run through and kill the boss and kill what we need to kill along the way. But I think we can kind of like more streamline our journey through this little scenario. But I'm loving Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion in general. I think Kristen's having a good time with it as well. The interplay with the cards is always fun. The ongoing campaign and storyline is really fun and compelling and interesting. And I mean, if it was up to me, I'd probably just sit down and crank through the rest of the campaign in a day or two. But there are other things in life, so we don't always have the time to do that. The other game that we played was Exit the Abandoned Cabin. And I'm a little bit on the fence about whether or not I should do a review video for Exit the Abandoned Cabin. And the reason behind that is, first of all, I think I'd barely consider Exit the Abandoned Cabin a board game. It's not really a board game. I know it's talked about a lot in board game circles, the exit games and the unlock games, but it's not really a board game. I mean, first of all, there's no board right there. But more importantly, there's not really a cycle of gameplay as there are in board games or even card games. You're really just solving puzzles. And this is the only exit game that I've played. And there are essentially 11 puzzles in the game. And none of the puzzles really impressed me that much. I mean, some of them were smarter than other puzzles in the game. You know, like there were puzzles that you looked at and you could just solve instantly. And some of the puzzles required more thought. But none of them really grabbed me. And the other thing is, if you buy the game at MSRP, it's a $15 game. And I don't really feel that that price is warranted. I got the game on a pretty big sale. I got it for about $7. And that's probably about the price point that I would recommend people buying the game at. Yeah. So I think if I were to make a review, it really wouldn't be, it would be sort of a shrug of a review, because I wouldn't give it a positive review, but I also wouldn't give it a negative review. And so much of the experience with this game is going to be determined by the puzzles. Are these puzzles that you solve too easily? Are these puzzles that are frustratingly difficult for you? I mean, they're going to be different for everybody. So it's going to be very much a case of your mileage may vary with this game. I would say that if you do buy it, try to grab it on sale. And the other thing is, the exit games are kind of known as being these destructible games, kind of like a legacy game, where you play it once, you write on cards, you rip things up, and then when it's done, it can't be replayed because you've destroyed the game. And knowing that, going into Exit, knowing that, my fiance and I definitely destroyed things. And I did it purposely. Like, I would write on cards because I knew going in, this game is going to be trashed. Now, had I not done that, had I not been so quick to write on cards and do things like that, the game actually instructs you to destroy very little. I think there is one part of the game where you need to fold a piece of paper, which you could kind of half fold without putting a crease into it if you wanted. And there's another part in the game where you could cut some things up, but you don't really have to. You could get away with not doing it. So I think my advice to anybody, buying Exit the Abandoned Cabin, and I don't know if this is the case for other Exit games. I don't know if other Exit games are more destructive. They may very well be. But for Exit the Abandoned Cabin, I think if you go into it knowing that you can cheat around it and not destroy the game, that way at the end of your experience with it, you can still give it away to somebody else. You could donate it to a children's hospital. You could conceivably sell it. I think it's very easy to not destroy the game. But someday down the line, I will get an unlocked game, which is similar to the Exit games. However, the unlocked games are not destructive. When you finish an unlocked game, you won't really want to play it again because you'll know the answers to all the puzzles, but nothing in that game is destroyed. So that can be very easily passed on or sold. And I'll have to see how I compare the two at some point in the future. But for right now, I will say that Kristen and I really enjoyed playing Exit, the version that we played, the Abandoned Cabin, and we had a really good time with it. We enjoyed the puzzles. We just weren't really that impressed by the puzzles. I would have liked more puzzles. I would have liked better puzzles. But on the flip side, I didn't think it was terrible. So it's very I'm glad I finally played an Exit game. We had fun with it, but I wouldn't tell you to run out and grab it unless you could find it for half to 2/3 off. And I think just go in maybe having your expectations lowered, knowing that the puzzles may not be as good as you're hoping or expecting. There's definitely some cleverness there. There's some cleverness to the packaging and to the puzzles themselves. It's not a dud. It's kind of in this gray medium area where I think people's reactions to it may be very divergent, so it's very hard for me to kind of predict and tell you if you're going to like it or not. I just think if I had to give it a number, I'd probably give it a 6, which is just kind of So that's my reaction to it. I'm glad I played it. I don't regret it. And I don't know. I'll probably grab another Exit game at some point in the future if I can find it for a similar price, like $5 to $8. So next, let's talk about the games that I actually acquired. And all 3 of these this month, or now it's going to be 2-week periods now that I'm publishing these videos every 2 weeks. So these are all Kickstarters that I've acquired in this last 2-week period. And rather than putting up a thing on the screen like I've been doing in the past, I'm actually going to just show them to you, since I can easily do that with only 3 games. So the first game is called Loot of Lima. And Loot of Lima is sort of a deduction game. If you've played Clue, or, Awkward Guests is a little more gamery version of Clue, or even Battleship, you'll know what I'm talking about in terms of, not social deduction, but deduction. And Loot of Lima, let's get this back over here for a minute, because it is a pretty neat looking game. I really like the art on it. It's pretty cool. It's still in the plastic, as you can tell, it's kind of shiny. But it's pirate themed and it's treasure themed. And players are basically looking for treasure on this island. And there's 3 different types of terrain on the island. There's shore area, there's mountain area, and there's forest area. And then the island is kind of divided into 8 quadrants. So there are 24 different locations that the treasure could be. And there's a main board that kind of has almost like a clock face, like 2 hands of a clock. And every turn, someone will roll these 3 dice that will give them 3 different directions. They'll pick 2 of those directions, and then they'll aim the clock hands on the map in those directions. And then they'll be able to choose either side of the map. So either the area that's kind of within the smaller space between the hands, or the area that's kind of in the larger space between the hands. And they can ask one other player 1 question about the areas in between there. Everyone starts the game knowing that the treasure is not buried in, I think it's like 5 locations. It changes a little bit based on player count. And then you spend the rest of the game asking players questions, and much like with Clue or with Battleship, keeping track of what the players are saying on a player board. So everyone has kind of a player board with a map on it, like the main board, as well as player screens. And there are a few little tokens that you can use to give you little kind of one-time player abilities to help you in different ways. But really what you're doing is you're recording the no's when people tell you where something is not, and then you're using inference to determine where things could be, much like in Clue. And I don't really have a game like that. I tend to, I do play a lot heavier games, and so lately I've been looking for some lighter stuff. And I don't have anything that's kind of deduction in this way, and I thought it looked really neat. I thought the player screens and the little tokens that you get that you press into your player screen, and the way you record the information that people give you, all of that seemed really, really interesting to me. So now I have Loot of Lima, and hopefully I'll get it played at some point in the future. Now there is a 1 to 2 player variant, so you can play a solo game. You can also play with just one other person. I do know that the Kickstarter version of the rules for the 1 and 2 player was horribly bungled, and it's not, that part of the rule book is not workable. So if you got Loot of Lima and you haven't realized that yet, please know that. I think you can download a P&P version, and if you really want a republished, like a new printing of it, you can write Chad, I think it's Chad Deshone, who was behind the publish version of this game, and they'll send you a new rulebook. Okay. The second Kickstarter that has arrived is Roam and Roll. Now this game is designed by David Turksey, who is a designer that I really, really like, and Nick Shaw. And the two of them did another roll and write game a year or 2 ago called Welcome to Dino World. And I don't own any roll and write games, so I did back a couple different ones within the last year or so. This was one of them, and you see there's this is a little expansion thing that came with it. There's also some erasable pens, and then there's some figures that came with the Kickstarter. So I did get this one. I also backed one called 7 Bridges. So I have now added 2 roll and write games to my collection. 7 Bridges has not yet delivered, so take a look at that one when it finally does. And the third game that was acquired this period is Martin Wallace's Struggle of Empires. Now, this is, I think it's a dudes on a map game, really, and a little bit of a war game, civilization game. Like a lot of Martin Wallace games, I've heard that there's some complexities to some of the economics that may need a player or two to be kind of fully grasped. This is a game that probably won't get to the table for me right away because I think it's played better at higher player counts. I think it's actually designed to be a 3 and up game, so plays 3 to 7. And Kristen and I have been playing kind of lighter games lately and kind of campaigny stuff. So this game feels like something that really needs like a good, heavier game group to get together, which right now is tough to do during COVID and isolation. So I may have to wait until after that. And I am excited to play it eventually, though. And I think Martin Wallace is a great designer. There was a time when I was considering backing the Brass games, Brass Lancashire and Brass Birmingham, and I was a little worried that they might be too dry. And I eventually got them, and I'm really glad I did because they are not dry. They're 2 of my favorite games. I think Martin Wallace is a great designer. I love Age of Steam. I also like Railways of the World. I also have Australia, which is a really, really neat game, which takes some of the train mechanics and the economic stuff that he uses in other games, and then he puts it on this this map of Australia with Cthulhu theming and zombies and stuff like that. And it's very much a Euro game. It's you're placing tiles and building kind of train networks, but you're doing this, and you're building troops, and you're doing all this with the end goal of mining resources, but also defeating these awakening Cthulhic monstrosities. And it's a really, really fun game. I'm also looking to get my hands on Wildlands at some point, which is kind of Martin Wallace's take on a dudes on a map skirmish game, which seems interesting. But in general, I think Martin Wallace is a great designer, and I will be excited to play this game eventually. I just don't think it will happen for a little bit of time yet. Okay, so that brings us to the last section of this video, which are the Kickstarters that I backed this period. And there are two of them. One of them is Arkwright, the card game. And the reason that I backed that is I have a friend who, for a long time, kept talking up Arkwright, the board game. We would play some economic games, some of these heavier economic games, and he was always talking up Arkwright, the board game. I say Arkwright, the board game, but really it's just called Arkwright. Now, Arkwright is out of print, and I looked into it a little bit when the Arkwright, the card game Kickstarter was out, because I thought, God, I really just want Arkwright, the board game. But it's out of print, it's hard to find, and so then I started thinking about Arkwright, the card game. Arkwright, the card game is I don't want to call it a redesign, although it is the same game with design tweaks. And it's made smaller, it's made less complicated. It's more kind of card focused. It doesn't have all of the large sets of mechanics that Arkham, the board game, has. So I thought, if I eventually do get the actual Arkwright game, there may even be places in a collection for both. Arkwright, the card game, will get played in situations where you're looking to play an economic game, but something that maybe takes up less table space and plays quicker and is less complex. So it may also be a great way, if I do eventually get Arkwright, the board game, to teach and introduce players to a lot of the systems and mechanics of the board game version, but doing it as a smaller baby step, the wading pool, if you will. So we'll see. Maybe at some point, if I ever do get the board game version, I will sell my copy of the card game. But the way that Arkwright, the board game, is not very available, that may be so far off that I may be very glad that I have Arkwright, the card game, in the interim. And the last game that I'm going to talk about today is Glenmore 2 Highland Games. Now, Glenmore 2 Chronicles is a game that I backed during the first Kickstarter. And it's a tile laying game. It uses a time track. So there's kind of almost a rondel of tiles. And players can go forward on this rondel to take a tile that they want to take. Because it's a time track, which means that whoever's furthest back gets to go. It means that if you jump very far forward to take a tile that you really, really want, you may be leaving many tiles exposed for players to, come and kind of scoop up. So as a player, your decision is always, do I take a tile that's not that far forward that will benefit me, but is not the tile that I want most, and then I'll get to go again soon? Or do I go even further forward, get the tile that looks great and it is exactly what I want, but that will then may give other players a few turns in between to kind of scoop up some of these other tiles. And you're kind of building this tile network. It reminds me a little bit of Keyflower in the sense that everyone is building their own kind of tile network. And while there is some player interaction that's more indirect, but I still have not gotten Glenmore 2 Chronicles to the table, but I've heard nothing but good things about it. I'm really excited to play it. And so backing the new expansion seemed like a no-brainer to me. Now, the new expansion adds in 3 more Chronicles, and Chronicles are basically modules that you can add into the game. I think the first one had 8 or 10. So this adds 3 more. And when you're playing the game, you can either just play the base game, or you can kind of pick and choose any number of these modules or chronicles to add into the game for more mechanics and more variability. And it also has a solo mode. So people who, got Chronicles before, if you back this, you'll now be able to play the whole game solo. And I think the Kickstarter's done fairly well, and as it's gone on and on, they have made more and more of the Chronicles compatible with the solo mode. I don't know that everything was compatible with the solo mode originally, but I think most everything is now. So that brings us to the end of this video. Hopefully it's shorter than the last ones. And I would ask you, especially if you made it all the way through, please like the video, please subscribe, and then if you want, hit the alarm bell so that you can be notified when I publish future videos. I am going to have a couple more videos coming out very soon. One of them is going to be a teach for Fort, and I may or may not do a review video for Exit the Abandoned Cabin. If I do a video for that, you've already kind of heard my thoughts on the game. I will show you a little bit in that video how the mechanics of the puzzles work without revealing any of the puzzles themselves. So I just need to think on that and decide whether that's something worth doing or not. Yeah. So thank you very, very much for spending some time with me, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.